Okay, it's 9 o'clock. It's top of the hour. Hello, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the July version of the Heart of Cary Association meeting. Very excited about today's event. Grateful for our panelists for being here this morning, Tru Petigrew and Tony Godwin, and for our moderator, Rose Cornelius, for taking the time to help us highlight the importance of this movement, this beginning of starting the conversations. What we're finding is that it's hard for a lot of people. And today you're going to learn how to get those conversations started. You're going to learn how these two gentlemen got those conversations started and how you can do the same thing within your community. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panelists and just share with you a brief personal history. I happen to have the good fortune of meeting Tru and Tony at a leadership Cary experience. And for those of you who have not heard about the leadership Cary experience, it's an amazing program. If you have any desire whatsoever to be involved in some kind of leadership role and a nonprofit in our area, take the time, go through the program, experience it, and you'll get introduced to movers and shakers like these two gentlemen right here. This is for the benefit of those who are watching this recorded. Tony retired in 2019 as Chief of Police for the town of Cary. His 30-year career with the police department began as an intern when he was a senior at NC State University. Following graduation, he began as a patrol officer and went on to work nearly every assignment in the department over the next 3 decades. He served as a director for Region 7 for the North Carolina Association of Chiefs of Police, the chairman of Carolinas Region for the Atlanta, Carolinas High Intensity Drug Trafficking Area through the USDA. And finally, he was appointed by the governor of North Carolina as a state commissioner for the Industrial Hemp Commission. During the last 6 years of his career, Tony found his passion for building bridges between law enforcement and communities of color, which is the work he continues today through his partnership with Tru Petigrew at truaccess.com. That's tru-access.com. Tony's been married to Shannon, a former law enforcement officer, and they have 2 sons, Wyatt, who's 18, and Colton, who's 9. And I think I got those right.
Yep, you did. But I do want to point out that I'm still married to Shannon, so it sounded like it was past tense.
Oh, sorry.
In case she listens to this, I want to make sure I clear that up.
It sounded that way.
Tru Petigrew is a celebrated author, an engaging speaker, a committed community leader, and an advocate, an award-winning marketing executive with 20 years of experience at nation's top advertising and marketing agencies. He currently serves as the president of truaccess.com, which is an inspiration and empowerment consultancy that serves individuals and organizations by helping them bridge gaps. His first book, Millennials Revealed, serves as a guide for countless individuals and organizations across the country to help them build meaningful connections across diverse generations. As a diversity and inclusion advocate and committed community bridge builder, Tru has established a strong reputation for building bridges across racial, cultural, social, and relational lines. Tru currently lives in Cary, North Carolina with his wife of 17 years, Tamika, and their 7-year-old son, Austin. And our moderator this morning is Reverend Dr. Rose Cornelius. She's an ordained minister who's been in ministry for over 30 years. She's served churches in North Carolina, Georgia, Virginia. She's ministered in over 100 churches and led mission teams to over 25 nations on 6 continents. She has served as a chaplain and a chaplain resident at Wake Med in Raleigh, is the development director at Dorcas, where she raises money for programs and services to help people in crisis. And in her years of ministry, she's raised millions of dollars for local and international projects. She's the past president and current board member of the Heart of Cary Association. I'm proud to serve with her. She is also a board member of the Morrisville Chamber of Commerce and a member of the Morrisville Rotary Club. Please help me welcome our panel today, and you have the floor, Rose.
Good morning, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you to this discussion on race and policing in Cary. First of all, thank you so much for joining us. These conversations don't happen enough in our country. Conversations on race can particularly be uncomfortable and messy, and so most people avoid them. And this avoidance has led to disparities in almost every area of our nation, from housing to healthcare to education, economics, and even our justice system. This discussion is born out of the tragic events surrounding the murder of George Floyd, an unarmed Black man by a police officer. Mr. Floyd's death was one of many high-profile killings of unarmed African Americans at the hands of police. His death seemed to ignite people in all parts of the world to protest against police brutality. I'm sure in this audience, there are varying views about policing and race. And those views probably range at one end of the spectrum with people who think that all police are great and are paragons of virtue and can do no wrong, all the way to the other end of the spectrum where people might think that all police are no good and police departments should be defunded. And that's why we've called upon these two gentlemen to help us to navigate these choppy waters. Joining me today, Tru Petigrew and former police chief, Tony Godwin. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
First of all, how did the two of you come into partnership around race and policing?
TG, I'll let you take that one. I usually start off responding to that question, but I'm going to sit back and hear your version of the answer to that question.
All right, I'm going
to like my version better, but I want to hear your version.
I'm going to tell y'all what Tru would have told you if he'd have spoke. So Tru, Tru lives here in Cary. He's a resident of Cary, has been here for many, many years. And it all started for us back in 2014. And, Tru, although he lives in Cary, he's not from Cary. He grew up in Baltimore. He lived in Baltimore, and then throughout his life, he lived in other cities in Atlanta and Los Angeles and Boston. And let's just sum it up to say Tru had some less than ideal experiences with law enforcement, some interactions with law enforcement that did not leave him with a good impression of law enforcement. And so he brought those experiences with him and carried them through life and found himself here in Cary. And then in 2014, we had the incident that occurred in Ferguson, Missouri. And of course, we know that was an incident that affected us all, much like the George Floyd incident affected us all, even though it was a long ways away. And it was those experiences that he had and seeing what happened in Ferguson that really propelled him to want to do something to have an impact here locally. And so he came to the Cary Police Department back in August of 2014. And now this is the part that he would tell you that he walked up to our front door and kicked that front door in and stood in the middle of the lobby and in a very loud voice demanded to speak to somebody, that he was tired of the foolishness that was going on and somebody was going to be accountable and going to answer some questions.
That's right.
That's the story that Tru would tell you. Now I'll just point out.
Did you get that door fixed?
What's that?
Did you get the door fixed yet?
Well, so let me address the door for everybody that's here, and I want to make sure everybody understands our front door opens out, right? Think about that. If it opens out, you can't kick it in. It doesn't go that way. It's not even possible. And so, but that's the story Tru tells. So if you're ever telling this story out on the street, we got to protect the street cred. Go with the kick the door open version. But in all seriousness, Tru did come to the police department, and he did ask to speak to somebody because he had a certain amount of angst that was going on, based on his experiences in life, and now having a young 2-year-old son that he was raising in Cary. He wanted to know what does our police department look like, and what is that interaction going to look like when his son Austin gets a little bit older and perhaps gets into some mischief. What is that interaction going to look like? And so he started a conversation, and he had the opportunity to speak to our community services sergeant, Jeremy Bergen, JB. Many of you probably know JB. He's hard to miss. And it was that interaction that led to Tru and I meeting and the work that we do today. They had a great conversation, and JB challenged him to let's work together to change the impression of the Cary Police Department with folks that have, concerns about law enforcement. Let's work together to have an impact on that. And that was where that relationship was born. And so we've been doing this work now for over 6 years, and it's just made some amazing. We had some amazing results as a result of this partnership.
So now I understand that you do barbershop talks. Why did you go to a barbershop? What prompted you? Tru, I'm sure you could speak on how important that is in our culture.
No, absolutely. When JB challenged me, and I just want to acknowledge JB for the way that he received me, because I know now that there was a lot of angst and animus in my approach, and JB received me in a very welcoming way. And as a part of his challenge to me to figure out ways to help the Cary PD better connect with the Black community, my way of accepting that challenge was to invite them to the barbershop where I know these conversations are happening. And just to explain the culture of the Black barbershop, if you've never had the Black barbershop experience, the Black barbershop in the Black community represents a very trusted and credible voice of the Black community, particularly for Black males. It's a place of refuge where you can go and you are comfortable to share and discuss and talk about anything and everything, from sports to politics, social issues. Nothing's off limits. And so these conversations about what was going on across the country were already taking place in the barbershop. And so my way of accepting the challenge was to include the officers in those conversations that were already taking place. And what I had realized is the conversations were taking place, one, without the voice of law enforcement being represented, and two, without the benefit of law enforcement hearing these concerns of the members of this community, and realizing that as long as it was just us talking amongst ourselves, no real change was going to take place, because the people that needed to hear it, that could participate in affecting the change, weren't a part of the conversation. Mm-hmm. And so we started barbershop rap sessions as a way to allow all of us to hear the diverse perspectives that we all shared, and quickly realizing that we all want the same thing. And then that became a platform for us to leverage as a way to collaborate on ways to achieve the inclusive environment that we all sought to achieve.
Well, that couldn't have been easy, though, in the beginning, because you have police officers entering this environment, this haven, of safety for Black men. And so how was that, those initial meetings?
Those initial meetings were extremely uncomfortable.
I'm sure.
I will say this, and Chief can chime in on this. In my perception, they were more uncomfortable for the police than they were for the patrons of the barbershop, because we were at home. So that was a natural environment and a place of comfort for the patrons of the barbershop. And so, although the conversations, but there were still members of the community that were uncomfortable having members of law enforcement there, sitting alongside police officers, and didn't want to be there. So it was very strained in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say that you know, it's interesting. At that point in my career, I had been in this business for about 23 years. And I can honestly say that that Saturday morning that we decided we were going to go to the barbershop for the very first time and have this conversation, going in the black barbershop shortly after Ferguson and all the unrest that was there, you know, around the country. That was the most frightening part of my career. And that sounds crazy to say, right?
That's very telling.
I know, right? And it's you know, when you look at all the things I've had the opportunity to do through the years, you know, I've worked undercover and I've worked on the tactical team and all those things. None of that was as scary to me as going in the barbershop that first day. But the reason is that, excuse me, is that I had been trained to deal with tactical issues. I had been trained to work undercover operations. I had had training for all of this. I've never been trained in how to have a conversation about police and the black community. Never had any training for that. And so that was a really scary kind of proposition to go in, but I knew that we needed to do it. And I'll tell you, it was one of the proudest moments because I put a message out to the department and said, look, we're going to do this conversation. You know, I don't know who's going to be there. The only thing I can promise is I'm going to be there. So if you're interested, join us. And I didn't tell anybody to show up. And when I pulled in that parking lot that morning, there were 14 police cars in the parking lot. And I was so proud of our agency that there was at least that many people. And when I got in, there were more people that were not working and in plain clothes. But I was so proud that there were so many people in our agency that were willing to voluntarily walk into that very uncomfortable situation because they understood that although it's uncomfortable, it's incredibly necessary. And they wanted to be a part of that conversation and a part of the change that we were seeking. So I was really proud of everybody for showing up that day. And then what was interesting was at the end, the owner of the barbershop, his name's Tron Watson, and Tron was no fan of the police either, but Tron agreed to allow us in because Tru, you know, vouched for us and said, I think this will be a good thing. And so at the end, Tron said, well, appreciate y'all being here. If you want to come back, you're welcome to come back. He said, but next time you come, one police car. He said it could be the SWAT truck full of cops, but only one police car, because if a brother pulls up and sees 14 police cars in the parking lot, he ain't coming in. And I'll still try to run a business. I said, well, that makes a lot of sense.
I wondered about that. 14 police cars. Wow. I mean, true. I'm sure you could talk to Tron's fears and, you know, trepidation about bringing all those police officers to a business, a black business with black customers. Just, it could have been a powder cake, especially after Ferguson. How did you manage to do that? How did you navigate that? What were the initial conversations like?
I have to be completely transparent and honest, and I cannot take credit for what happened and what has transpired since then. And I know a lot of people don't fully understand this. And when I share it this way, I think people view it as a cop-out, quite honestly. But Rose, all I can say to you is that it was divine design, quite honest. I mean, I can give you no other explanation.
I can relate to that, too.
I can give you no other explanation than I went to Tron and said, hey, Tron, this is what I would like to do. And Tron and I have a really good relationship. He's like a brother to me. Because I knew Tron had similar experiences as me with law enforcement. So I knew he did not like police. He did not trust police. So on a personal level, it was almost a miracle that just personally, but then to think about how it could potentially impact his business to allow law enforcement to come in, because knowing that many of his patrons had similar experiences as Tron and I, because we talked about it enough times in the barbershop. And it's unfortunate that my experience with law enforcement is not the exception. It was more the rule for people that look like me than anything. And so we knew that other men would be hesitant, but I approached him. He trusted me. He believed in me, but he did say, now, if this goes south, it's all on you. He did put that on me, but I can only say it was divine design.
True. Let me just say, and let me ask you to describe a little bit of your experience with police, because so many people cannot relate to the African American experience with police and why there's so many barriers. So just briefly, could you just, in a nutshell, tell us of some of your interactions with police?
Well, growing up in Baltimore, the neighborhood in which I grew up, there was a lot of violence, a lot of crime, a lot of drugs. And so the police that policed that community where I grew up policed it in a very heavy-handed way, regardless of whether you were an active participant in any of that criminal activity or not. And so me and my friends who were not active participants in those activities were on the receiving end of excessive force on a regular basis. And then one incident in particular in LA, I was coming out of a 7-Eleven. I was living in the Crenshaw district, so it was predominantly Black and Hispanic community. And I was coming out of a 7-Eleven one day and a bunch of police cars had pulled up, coming in with intention, like clearly something's going on. Officers jump out, they're screaming, they're yelling. And I'm looking around wondering who they're screaming and yelling at because I knew I hadn't done it. I'm like, I just came out of the 7-Eleven. What could have possibly happened? One of the officers grabs me, he throws me to the ground, my bag goes flying, he presses my face against the concrete, he's got his knee in my back, and had drawn his weapon already, he pressed it against the side of my head. And his words to me were, give me a reason, I wish you would. Like he was taunting me to do something that would allow him the freedom, if you will, the permission, the justification to take my life is the way I interpreted it. And that ended up getting worked out, although I got taken down to the station. It was a case of mistaken identity. They got a call that a nearby 7-Eleven had been robbed, and it wasn't even a 7-Eleven where I was coming from. But apparently I fit the description, and so that was the outcome of that. But they caught the guy that actually did it, and which is why I was released. But that, coupled with my experiences growing up in Baltimore, are the reasons that I just never liked or trust police officers, you know, for majority of my adult life, up until 2014 when I met JB.
Interesting. I'm sure you never had anything like that happen to you, did you, Tony?
No, I never had anything like that happen to me for sure. And that's the thing. And Tru and I talk about this all the time. What's difficult for me is that I spent my entire 30-year career in Cary. And I'm not saying that Cary always got everything right, but we certainly, I speak my experience, I never saw anybody intentionally mistreat or do anything that was, you know, inappropriate. So it's hard for me when I hear these stories about law enforcement, you know, doing the wrong thing, because it hasn't been my experience in my 30-year career and all the hundreds of police officers and even thousands of police officers, if you count all around, you know, the country that I know. I don't know any of these guys that do things like this, but, you know, Tru and I are always careful to point out to everybody, we can't discount other people's experiences just because they're not our own. And that's really hard sometimes because our experiences are our experiences and we tend to think that's the way it always is. But that's not always the way it is. And so intellectually, I understand that there are officers that are doing the wrong thing. There are officers that aren't in this for the right reason. I don't know these people. I don't know these officers. I don't want those officers in the profession anywhere, and certainly not in my hometown. But I understand intellectually it occurs, but it's just hard to wrap my mind around because I've never known those kinds of officers. So you're right, I've never had those experiences, but I do understand intellectually that they happen.
I see on the chat that one of our participants talks about how we tend to live in two different worlds. And that's why we can't understand a lot of what is happening today, why people are so passionately still demonstrating in the streets against policing and against the violence and against the culture that has fostered all of this. So we go back to the barbershop. So we're having these conversations. You have a lot of police officers, you have people from the community. What are some of those difficult conversations? What came from that? Tru and Tony, could you address that?
Yeah, you would have very pointed questions that I know were taken in a very offensive way by some of the officers, because they've had those conversations with me since then. We are at a far, far better place. First started having those conversations, but there will be conversations from a patron that would say to an officer, why do you guys always shoot to kill Black people? Right? Now, I can understand now that if I'm that white officer and I know that is not who I am, that is not what I represent, that's a hurtful question to be projected onto me. But I think we've gotten to the point where those officers have learned that it's not personal, because that's not who I am, right? But that's the perception that's had because of life experiences, and then the images that we all see that are played on social media and in traditional media. And so the education of that is what I think has been one of the most fruitful things, is when the officer can then explain that, well, no, we're not trained to shoot to kill anyone. Like when where our training and our expectations are to preserve life, whether it's our own, someone else's life that is threatened around us, or even the very person who is posing the threat, to preserve their life. Because after we have ensured that all lives are safe and preserved for someone that is posing the threat, by us eliminating the threat, and that the center body mass is the largest portion of the body, that is how we're trained. Because if I try to shoot someone's ankle or wrist or leg, chances are, none of us are Navy SEALs. It's not what you see on TV. It's not going to happen. And if a life is threatened, and I'm trying to take my time, take my time to hit a body part that is probably too small for me to be accurate enough to hit. So we go for center body mass, but after that, our obligation is to then render aid to the very person that we were put in a position to render that force against. So I think the educational piece of it, and then for the officers to understand that, okay, but you know what? That's good for me to know. Now I'm in a better position to hold my law enforcement agency accountable, now that I understand what the expectations are. And for officers to realize not every officer that wears that uniform adheres to that expectation.
And we certainly don't want to paint all police as being bad. We know there are many good police officers. Unfortunately, the ones that are not as good and could be considered bad and are flagrant, like what we saw demonstrated with George Floyd, there seems to be a blue wall of protection around those officers. And many activists see the police unions, for instance, standing as a hindrance to reforming and removing those officers. Tony, could you address that?
Yeah, well, so I could address it and start by saying I can't address it nationally because just as you pointed out, Dr. Cornelius, unions in many places are part of the issue. But here in North Carolina, we don't have unions. We don't have collective bargaining here in North Carolina. So my personal experience, I've never dealt with unions. I've never had to deal with the processes and loopholes and roadblocks that unions create. Although I know many police chiefs in other parts of the country and have talked to them about that, but I haven't had those experiences. But here in North Carolina, I can tell you that one of the challenges is there is a state personnel law, and that is all public employers throughout North Carolina have to adhere to the state personnel laws. And those laws are written such that we can't talk about disciplinary actions with employees in the public, right? And so what happens oftentimes is people complain about an officer. I can tell you that Cary is and has been for decades an accredited agency. And because we're an accredited agency, we have always taken complaints, no matter how they come in, no matter whether they're signed or not. They can be emailed, mailed, phoned in anonymously. You can put your name behind it. Doesn't matter to us. We're going to investigate all complaints. And so we get these complaints, we investigate them. But one of the problems, I believe, is we're not allowed to give feedback on the results of those complaints because of state personnel law. Now, we deal with the issues, and perhaps even includes up to and including dismissal. But we can't tell the complainant that, because if I do that as a police chief, I have just violated the state personnel law, and now I can be held civilly and perhaps even criminally negligent for violating that state personnel law. And so our hands are tied somewhat with respect to being able to provide that, close that loop and that feedback. Unfortunately, the best we can do because of the laws is just assure people and say, trust me when I tell you, we are going to fully investigate these things. If we find out that there was wrongdoing on our part, we're going to take appropriate action, up to and including dismissal if that's what's appropriate. But we can't close the loop based on that state personnel law. So I think that creates more of a feeling that nothing's happening because you don't get the satisfaction of knowing what happened. But just, again, all I can do is assure you that things do happen and we do take those things very seriously. Because here's the thing, nobody would like to get rid of a bad cop more than a good cop. Because we don't want a bad cop representing our profession. I don't want them representing my badge, my uniform. Believe me, I want that even less than everybody else does. And so when I say we take that very seriously, trust me when I tell you, we take that very seriously and we deal with it. But unfortunately, we can't always report back.
And unfortunately, there's not a national registry for police officers who've been disciplined or shown flagrant violations. Would you be in favor of such a registry?
Yeah, I wouldn't have any problem with that. And I can tell you that North Carolina changed the law several years ago that allows police chiefs to note on the paperwork. So in North Carolina, all police officers are certified through the North Carolina training and standards. And so all the paperwork that certifies you to operate as a police officer goes through training standards. And so there's paperwork to be filled out when you bring somebody on. There's paperwork to be filled out when somebody leaves your agency, whether they're dismissed or they voluntarily leave or go to another agency. And so there wasn't always the ability to put, really honest and truthful, information on those forms that would trigger another police chief that was considering somebody to look deeper and do a good in-depth background investigation. The law was changed, the forms were changed a few years ago that allows us to be a little more open about that on those forms, which again is not necessarily open to the public, but it is open to other law enforcement agencies. And when they get those forms and see why somebody left, all the information won't be there, but it will raise a red flag that allows them to come to the agency that the person left and look into the personnel file and see what those issues are and make some determinations about whether or not they want to bring them into their agency. So, there are things that do that. I certainly got no problem with the national registry that would highlight and illuminate the officers that are bad officers. We certainly don't want them anywhere, not in North Carolina, but not anywhere in our profession.
And Tru, what are your thoughts on a national registry?
I'm in favor of it because I think that's part of the challenge. Early on in this work, I've realized that this issue is not relegated. And I think it's important that we all understand this, that the listeners understand this, that this issue is not relegated to law enforcement. This is a heart issue that exists within human beings, within people. And some of those people happen to have finagled their way into the law enforcement profession. Some of those people happen to have finagled their way into education, our financial institutions. And this is an issue across all of the institutions in our society. Now, I think they are much more detrimental when we're talking about industries or professions such as law enforcement, education, and healthcare. because of the responsibility that comes with those professions. And so to me, it is about doing our best to recruit and retain people with the right heart, and to provide as many tools and resources as possible to those who have the responsibility at a chief level of bringing in people into that organization, so that they can have all the possible information available to them to discern whether that person has the right heart, and not basing it solely on their tactical abilities to deliver on the functionality, but making sure that this person has the right heart. Because at doing training for as long as I've done, I've come to the realization, you can have all the training in the world, but if your heart is not right, it does not matter. So I am all in favor of providing as much information as possible to discern whether or not that individual has the right heart for this profession.
Interesting, because I think about, I looked at statistics the other day about police stops across the nation, but also in the Triangle and even in Cary. There are some stark disparities in the number of Black and brown people that are stopped by police versus white people, for instance. What you were talking about, people with heart and culture and all of that informs how we respond and who we stop and who is suspect. Could you all address that? How do we as a country and as a community lower those numbers to make it more equitable so that there's not these glaring disparities?
I think, and I'm not sure where TG stands on this, but my thoughts are a large reason that happens is because we all have unconscious biases. We all have unconscious bias. Not an indictment on anyone, not a condemnation on anyone. All four of these good-looking people that are on my screen right now, it applies to us. Right? We all have unconscious bias. And what we need to understand about unconscious bias is that it exists at a subconscious level. So you're not even aware of the behaviors that it causes. And it's also counter to what we believe we are or who we believe we are. So we don't even want to believe that we have the capacity to behave this way. And so those are two things that really should encourage us to acknowledge the unconscious biases that exist within us so that we can address them. And your unconscious bias is formed based on your life experiences and how you've been conditioned to view a certain people group, right? Whether that is Black people, whether that is Latinx, whether that is women, whether that is men, whether that's older, young. So your unconscious bias has conditioned you to view certain people groups through a certain lens based on your life experiences. And until we, one, acknowledge that we have them, and then two, be willing to address them, because there are things that we can do to minimize when our unconscious bias is triggered. And a quick approach to that is visualization, visualizing someone different in a situation that we may assume someone will be in. So if I show up and I just think that the pilot is going to be a middle-aged white man when I hop on a plane before I even get on it, visualize that person being a Hispanic woman or a Middle Eastern woman or a Black woman, just to now visualize so I'm not as caught off guard. It affects my behavior to treat them differently when I see that it's something different than I expected. And then examination, to self-examine ourselves, to be very introspective as to how we treated someone that looked differently than we expected them to look, or maybe look like we expected them to look. Be very honest with ourselves as to, did we treat that person differently because they looked a certain way? And then the normalization piece is where it really helps to minimize our unconscious bias, is to normalize diversity in our lives, in our personal and professional circles. So the more diversity that we have in our lives, the less we're apt we are for our unconscious bias to be triggered, because it's just a normal part of our lives. And so when I see this Black person, I see this woman, I see this Asian person, it's such a common part of my life that my unconscious bias and how I treat them is not triggered.
Unfortunately, unconscious bias is very strong, and it shapes our world and how we interact with each other far too heavily. I'm thinking of just personal experiences, and I'm very sad when I think about how separated we are because of that. How I heard a report from one of the school board members that our school system now is basically segregated again. So it's, instead of us moving forward and working together, there are more divides and there are more superficial relationships. Decades ago, Dr. King said that the most segregated hour in America is at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning. So even if the churches can't bridge that divide largely, what hope is there?
Right.
You two have been working together though to build a bridge. And how is the building of that bridge coming? What results have you gotten as a result of your partnership, beginning with the barbershop talks and going further?
Well, go ahead, TG.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, and Dr. Cornelius, you really hit on the heart of the matter, right? Is that we have to, if we're going to overcome our unconscious biases, we have to be very proactive in living life, having experiences, working together alongside one another with people that don't look like you, whatever that difference is. We have to experience life side by side and work together. And we can't just wait for that to happen. We have to be proactive about making that happen. And that's what's happened with Tru and I. And we've been very proactive about that and our efforts in bringing the community together. And we have experienced life alongside one another. Yes, Tru and I, but also when I say us, I mean, you know, the men and women in the barbershop and the men and women in the Cary Police Department. You know, we have worked alongside each other. We have experienced things. We have done things like, you know, had father-son haircut day. We've had heart and art. We've gone and done movies together. And that's a really powerful thing, is to experience the same thing together and realize how it affects one another. And one of the most interesting things, we did a video a few years ago. Tru and I had the opportunity, along with Chief Letney and Chief Dick Brown in Raleigh, Chief Letney in Apex, to present at the International Association of Chiefs of Police Conference in Philadelphia on this very topic. And we were going to talk about the barbershops, but you know, we didn't have a budget to take the barbers with us. We wanted to take the barbers with us, but we didn't have a budget for that. So we created a video, and we sat the 4 barbers down, and we just interviewed them and asked them questions. And I so distinctly remember one of the questions we asked was, what has been a wow moment for you on this journey? And one of the barbers, a barber named Ant there at Headliners, he said, for me, the wow moment for me has been when we went to see the movie Detroit together. And we decided we were going to go as the barbershop and the police department, going to go together to see this movie Detroit. And if you've seen that movie, you know it's about the riots that occurred back in, I think, 1967 in Detroit. And the things that led up to that, and the police misconduct that led up to that. And so we went to see that movie as a group, and there was 10 police officers and 10 African-American men from the barbershop. And we sat side by side in this movie theater and watched this movie. And when I tell you it's a powerful movie, trust me when I tell you it is a powerful movie. And at the conclusion of it, there wasn't a word spoken. Everybody was just sitting there silently, right? Because it was so heavy and so powerful. And we all walked out very quietly. And when we got in the lobby, we kind of circled up, and I remember Tru speaking, and Tru said, I don't know what to say about what we just witnessed, except we need to pray. And we stood there and held hands in the lobby of this movie theater, and Tru led us through a prayer for you know, reconciliation in our country. And so when we asked that question, making the video, Ant's wow moment was, he said, when we went to see the movie Detroit together, he said, I looked over at you, Chief, And I saw that this movie affected you the same way it affected me. He said, I saw your tears. I saw the way that impacted you emotionally. He says, and I never would have thought it possible for it to affect a white police officer from the South the same way it affects me as a black man here in America. And so to experience that together, that's the benefit of living life alongside one another, not just talking, but experiencing things together. And I think that's where the magic happens. And that's what we work so hard to do here at Tru Access.
Well said. Intentionality is so important. We can't leave it to chance or, casual relationship. It sounded like when you all went to that movie together, you entered into the waters of the despair and you were able to taste some of what a brother like Tru has lived with, basically. Tru, how did that movie impact you? I know you were speechless at the end of it, but how did being there with those officers and with your other brothers, how did that impact you?
Similar to Ant, it was healing, quite honestly, and it was painful to watch, and it triggered, quite honestly, what I realize now was still some unresolved trauma in my own life from some of my own life experiences, seeing this and witnessing this. But for lack of a better phrase, I guess, what was comforting was sitting alongside men and women that I had viewed as the source and cause of that pain, knowing that they are allies and supporters that work alongside me to eradicate the actual source of that pain, knowing that those men and women weren't actually the source of that pain. There were some individuals that exist that contribute to that, but it was a sense of comfort of knowing that, wow, the men and women that at one point in my life I believed were the source of that simply because of the color of their skin and the badge that they wore. It was a revelation for me that I had gotten that part of it wrong. And it was comforting to me to know that there were people that I once thought were the source of my pain that are now the allies of reconciliation and restoration on this journey alongside me.
Yeah, I guess that's why it's so important to be intentional, to take somebody by the hand so that you learn about their journey and their experience. Tru, I'm still flashing back to when you said you had that gun at your head. I cannot imagine that. That's not easy to walk away from. You live that every day, I'm sure.
Yep.
So to have this counter experience helps to weigh that experience somewhat. So I so appreciate, again, I'm thanking everybody on this call. We're getting chats, comments, and just encouraging things, but these are difficult conversations to have. These are conversations that most people run away from because they're so difficult. They don't even know where to begin. Let's go back to the barbershop again. What do you think what are some of the fruit that has come from that? Not only in Cary, but in other communities. Could you tell us about that?
Well, yeah, that it has spread its wings, if you will, beyond Cary. And Chief referenced Chief Letney in Apex, coming to join us at a barbershop rap session in Cary through Chief's invitation, and then implementing that in Apex. So then we've had Chief Andrews from Morrisville, then in Garner, in Holly Springs, in Fuquay-Varina, in Roxborough, in Roanoke Rapids. Throughout the state, to see that this initiative has spread and impacted communities far beyond Cary, nationally, across the country, quite candidly. And then you see men and women who otherwise would not have even given each other the time of day, based on their biases and their perceptions of what the other one thought of them, that are now friends, that now are family friends. Their families connect and hang out and enjoy dinner together. That to see that these men and women have become friends with one another, that to me is what this is all about, allowing people the space to get to know one another on a human level. And so that's one of the most gratifying outcomes for me, is to seeing the relationships that are born out of this.
I think we've cheated each other out of not bridging these divides. We've denied each other relationship, meaningful relationship, life-changing experiences when we separate ourselves. So I commend you both for that. Tony, could you respond to that? How has this been transferred into a larger community? And then how has it affected the Cary PD?
So, I mean, as Tru said, you know, we started branching out from Cary proper based on stories that we would hear or comments we would hear in the barbershop. And I would hear probably the fourth or fifth time in the barbershop, I heard, okay, you guys are okay, but as soon as I leave your city limits, my radar goes back up. And you know, we got to thinking, you know, it doesn't have to be that way, because I know the men and women in Apex and in Morrisville and in Garner and Holly Springs and Raleigh and on and on and on. And so we started inviting, you know, police chiefs from all around to come and experience it, and to see how that grew, and it turned into barbershop experiences in their towns and in their cities. So it certainly has spread. And now what's interesting is, you know, if we have an event in Cary, you know, the officers from other agencies will show up, because there's this relationship, and it's not just, they're not just building relationships in the town of Holly Springs or in the town of Fuquay, because we recognize that we are individual communities, but none of us are confined to our individual communities, right? We live in Cary, we work in Apex, we shop over in Holly Springs, or vice versa. We go out to eat in Raleigh. You know, we all intermingle. And so we're all part of a big community. And so that's why it was important to us that we bring the larger group in, so that we can experience all that together. And so, you know, I could tell you lots of stories, Dr. Cornelius, about how things have impacted the police department, how it's impacted me personally, how it's impacted the community. You know, there's so many stories I could tell, but I'll tell you that one of the coolest stories for me was, and I found out about this through another officer, and another officer told me about two officers went into Chipotle here in Cary for lunch. And so when you're working patrol in Cary, you get 30-minute break for lunch. And that's, you know, that's your free time to kind of let your hair down, if you will, to relax, to not be on, so to speak. And so these two officers went to lunch, and you know how Chipotle works. You go in and you get in line. Well, they found themselves, you know, walking up and becoming the back of the line behind a young black female. And she didn't see them come in. So at some point she turned around and saw two uniformed police officers standing behind her, and she physically reacted to that, right? It startled her, and they saw it startle her. And they said something like, you know, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. And she said, it's okay. She said, I just get nervous around the police. And so a perfectly acceptable answer to that would be for them to say, well, you know, you don't have to be nervous around us. We're the good guys. We're, you know, don't be nervous. And that would have been fine, right? And they did say that, but it's what they said next that made all the difference. The next thing out of their mouth after they said that was, hey, look, why don't we grab our lunch and sit down and let's talk about why you feel that way around police. Let's talk about why you feel that way when you find yourself in the presence of a police officer. And so, to her great credit, somebody that's nervous around the police, she said, okay. And they got their lunch and they sat down and they spent, you know, probably the better part of an hour sitting there having a conversation. And the reason that's so significant is, look, that 30 minutes as a patrol officer, I've been there many, many times. That's my one chance to kind of turn it loose and just let the job go and just relax. And I can talk about sports, or I can talk about my family, or I can talk about whatever with my coworker. But instead, they saw the opportunity they had in front of them and said, you know what? We have a chance to impact the heart of this young lady. And they understood the importance and the value of that. And I don't know they would have had that same understanding had it not been for the journey we had been on in Cary and the conversations we had had in the barbershop, it probably would have just kind of passed them by, and they wouldn't have really realized the importance of that opportunity they had in front of them. I don't know how this story ends because I've never talked to the young lady, but I know this for a fact. When she walked out of that Chipotle, she felt a little bit better about police than when she walked into that Chipotle. I know that unquestionably, right? I don't know how big of an impact it had, but it had to have some impact. And I tell, you know, I used to tell, because I'm not the chief anymore. I have been retired for about 1.5 years. But I used to tell our folks all the time, we have innumerable opportunities every day to have that kind of impact. We just have to open our eyes and see them and take those opportunities when they present themselves. And so I could tell you all kinds of stories about that, the way it impacted us as a police department, the way it impacted our community. There's innumerable stories I could share.
I have a question on the chat line. What suggestions can you give a business on how to start conversations, address issues, to create diverse environments and more understanding, building bridges? Either of you.
I'll tell you what, TG, I have 2 thoughts, and we both share in these principles. So I'll talk about the importance of meeting people where they are. If you want to share the courageous conversations principles, I think that's a good way to address this, because I think they work in tandem, right? And so the one thing that I'll say is, from an overarching standpoint, is the importance of meeting people where they are. And I think we say that oftentimes, but we don't necessarily deliver on it. I think we meet people where we think they should be, or we meet people where we want them to be. And in order to be effective in this bridge building work, you have to meet people where they are, and knowing that we're all at different points on this journey. And that's physically, mentally, spiritually, emotionally, meet them where they are. And then when you meet them where they are, and that takes intentionality and effort on your part, then the maybe more challenging part is to love them where they are. Because you're not always going to love where they are. And trust me, I've run into that on numerous occasions on this journey. But I know the power of loving that individual where they are, even when I don't love where they are. And that is what it's going to take. And it's not easy, but if you're going to be an effective bridge builder, that's what it's going to take. And those are heavy materials. And so my question often to people are, how strong is your bridge? And you can build a straw bridge, but at the first gust of wind, that's going to collapse. You can even build a wood bridge, and that will be able to sustain more than the straw bridge, but it's not going to sustain over the long time. And so the heavy materials of meeting people where they are and loving people where they are is what it takes to build a fully reinforced steel bridge that will sustain the storms that will surely come your way, to test the strength of that bridge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Scott, you have a question for us.
Yeah, so I would just like to.
Let me go back. I'm sorry, before you ask your question, Tony,
Go right ahead.
the second part to that. I'm sorry, I didn't.
No, absolutely. So thanks for giving me the chance. You know, what Tru and I have found in years of doing this is that there's a process that you can follow that really helps elicit conversation. It helps elicit action steps, but there's a process you got to follow. And all too often, you know, when we're talking to folks about an issue, you know, the question that immediately comes up is, what can we do, right? What can we do? And people are ready to do something. And I get that. We're ready to take action and do something. But what we have found is there are things that we need to address before we get to the do part. And kind of our model for that is the heart, the head, and then the hands, right? We've found that if you follow the process of dealing with issues of the heart, then you work together to ideate some thoughts and ideas about how you can take action, and then you're ready to move to the actual do part. It's so effective that way. And so it's really important you start with that heart, though, because you've got to be able to get that out. You've got to be able to let people to to explain and express the way they feel. You know, there's so many times I've seen people arguing an issue and they're arguing emotionally. And then the person they're arguing with wants to argue factually, right? Those are two very different things. You cannot fight feelings with facts. It doesn't work, right? And I use the example all the time that Cary is perennially, you know, recognized as one of the safest nations in the country. Several years ago, the #1 safest city in America, right? But in spite of that, there were people that were victimized during that time period where Cary was the #1 safest city in America. Statistically speaking, couldn't have lived in a city and been any safer from crime. But if your house got broken into and you said, you know what, I don't feel safe, what good does it do for me to go, you know what, actually, you're safer here than anywhere you could possibly live. So don't worry about it. You know, the stats tell us that you're fine, right? That's not going to work because they do not feel safe. And so we have to deal with the emotions. We have to deal with issues of the heart. And once we get that out and people get a chance to express that, it helps us understand not just how people feel, but why they feel the way they feel. We've got to understand the why. We can't just understand the what. We got to understand the why. And once we're able to do that, now we can work together to come up with thoughts and ideas about things that we can do and throw some things on the board and make a list. And then once we get that list together, now we can talk about, okay, what are we going to do? It's time to put our hands to the plow. What are we going to do to address this issue? So heart, head, hands. That's the process we found. And in your life and in your business, we recommend if you want to have conversations about that, you follow that model. And we've seen that work time after time after time.
Exactly. Thank you, Tony. I recall I'm a part of a group called Racial Harmony, and it's black and whites, and our white brothers and sisters immediately want to do a project with us. They didn't know us. I said, no, we're not doing any projects. They said, why? I said, you don't know me and I don't know you. You don't know my experience and I don't know yours.
Yep.
I said, and we don't know very much about the issues that we want to help change. So let's learn together and let's get to know each other. And that way we can be more impactful as we go forward. And that's what we took the time to do. And that was dinners, that was lunches, that was meetings. But it took a couple of years to get to the point where we were actually doing something. I don't advocate people get their PhD in learning though, because there are things that we can put our hands to right now to make changes. But along the way, relationship is key. Relationship is key, and hearing from other people, that's key. Now I'll go to Scott. Scott, you had a question for all three of us.
Sure, thank you. Just in response to your comment, Rose, I would say that maybe a PhD in active listening would be a good place to start. So first of all, Tony, the heart, head, hand concept is brilliant. You know, we have a number of corporate professionals on the call, and one of the things that we're hearing, this theme is, okay, so what can we do next? What are some action steps that we can take? And this is really a question for the three of you. You know, in the past, I've found that most organizations, when trying to train their employees on diversity and inclusion, they mention that this is not necessarily, or no, they say very specifically, this is not in response to anything we've done wrong. But it's a corporate decision to be proactive to implement change. But with the understanding that, you know, many companies have failed at implementing this diversity and inclusionary training experience, you know, what would you suggest, how would you suggest they change that verbiage as they introduce the concept to their companies? And with that in mind, I understand, Tru, you're going to be at the Chamber Planning Conference in August?
I think so, yes.
Great, so that'll be a great opportunity for anybody on the call to actually meet you and learn a little bit about what you can do to help their organization. Would that be a true statement? Okay. So that's really a question for all three of you. How do you think corporations should go about changing the way they think? And Tony, if you want to just say that it's really all about the the heart, head, and mind, that's fine. But if you can think of anything else that would give some good action planning steps, that would be great.
Well, I think if you start by going in and saying this isn't a result of anything that we've done, but we're trying to be proactive. I mean, I understand that sentiment and I get it, but I think you're making some assumptions when you do that, right? I think a better approach is to go in and ask the question. Ask the question, what is the perception? How are people feeling? Tell us, give us feedback on what we're doing as a company, and where we perhaps don't know what we don't know. And I can only tell you that was my experience at Cary PD. Back in 2014, we brought together a group of faith-based leaders from throughout Cary, from predominantly African-American congregations. And we asked the question, what is the perception of the Cary Police Department in your congregation, in your organization, in your social circle, in your family? What is the perception of our police department? Now, we thought we were going to hear it's okay. We weren't crazy enough to think we were going to hear it's great, right? But we thought we'd at least get it's okay. What we got instead that night was the perception is that you protect and serve the white community and you police the black community.
Wow.
Think about that. That is not what we thought we were going to hear. And we realized in that moment, we've got some work to do. We thought we were okay, but we're not okay, because there are perceptions out there that persist about who we are. And we can tell you in our heart, that's not who we are, but we got to deal with the way people perceive us and the way they see us. And that was really one of the things that pushed us so vehemently into doing this work. And we've got to change that perception, right? But here's the thing. If we didn't ask that question, we would not have gotten that answer, right? People aren't going to wander up and tell you that, right? You got to ask the question. You've got to make yourself vulnerable, and you got to be willing to hear what you hear as a result of that, right? And so I encourage people, don't make assumptions about what the climate is. Ask the question. Because if you ask the question and you sincerely ask it, and people understand that sincerity and they feel safe to express their honest feelings, you'll get an answer. And it might not be the one you were ready for, but it is the one that you need to hear.
Fabulous. True?
Yeah, I'll share this, is that in my experience and being a diversity and inclusion practitioner in corporate America and taking that experience and transitioning it into the work that I've been called to do now, I see a stark difference in what I do and how I approach it, as I'm now being more spirit-led in my approach to do it. And I think it really revolves around purpose and intent. And I think oftentimes people are resistant and resent the D&I training that they receive because in the manner in which the trainer delivers it. And it is very judgmental and accusatory in tone oftentimes. And that doesn't make anyone feel good to show up and just get beat up for 2 hours, 4 hours, 8 hours and talk about everything, the finger shaking, this is why you're racist, right? We've learned and discovered that a more effective way is simply in how it's facilitated, and facilitated as a very intentional word, where the people are actively engaged and included in the process. And so the way that we do it is that it's a facilitated dialogue and an exchange of information. It is not judgmental and accusatory. People are sharing information, learning with and from one another about their experiences. We have the principles that can be applied to address whatever angst or divisions or differences that emerge, but we empower them with enough insight, information, and tools to have revelation themselves, because now they're included as a part of the solution. And where there's little to no inclusion, there will always be little to no commitment. But as you include others in the process, now they're more committed because they're vested. And so it's really allowing it to be a mutual exchange of information and sharing that is done via facilitated dialogue workshops and exercises where people are working alongside one another to come up with the revelation as to what works best for their culture. Because everywhere we go, the culture is different. Chief and I don't know the culture anywhere we go better than the people that are there, but they do. we equip them with the necessary tools and information to have the revelation themselves of ways that they need to change behavior, process, protocols, and policies.
Dr. Cornelius, bring us home. We potentially have millions of viewers, potentially millions, right? I want this to go viral. And I want you to take what we've just experienced with Tru and Tony, and I want you to send the word to the world, right, of the importance of carrying this message forward. Please share with us your perspective on this and what we can do to keep this conversation going.
Oh, since George Floyd's death, there has been an avalanche of statements made by companies, and they all seem to say the same things. They wish us good wishes. They hope for a better tomorrow, and they'll tacitly work toward change. But your actions will speak much louder than your words. While you might hire a minority or two, how are you allowing them to transform your environment? Or is your environment forcing them to be like everybody else? Are you listening to them? Are you respecting them? Are you valuing them? Are you taking into account their journey in life? They have some added value if you will embrace it. This conversation has been like a lot of conversations I've been in, very painful. What I've heard from this conversation, however, is the word intentionality. These two men have intentionally sought to work on a problem together. They intentionally built relationship. They intentionally went out to others to build a bridge. I tell people all the time, I don't need your sympathy. I need you to act. I need you to work to change this environment that is so cruel for some. An environment that marginalizes so many people and has for centuries. I thank you all for being on this call, for being a part of this conversation. I pray that this conversation will spur you to do more to make America a better place. I'm thinking about on the New York Times bestseller list, the top 10 books are on race. You don't have to look far to educate yourself on what is happening. Take a first step. Part of that is you participated today, but go beyond today. Be intentional. And those are my words. That's how I would close out, Scott. Thank you all. Gentlemen, what a pleasure it's been to be with you and to hear your story. I bless you. I just hope that you continue to do what you're doing and that you have impact, not only locally, not only regionally, but all over the nation.
Thank you for having us. Thank you so much.
Very, very grateful. Look forward to seeing you at the upcoming conference. That concludes our interview today. Again, thank you. I want to thank our many participants and to thank those who are watching this recording afterwards. I encourage you to visit tru-access.com, learn more about what they can do to help you and your organization. It's been Scott Corbin, President of the Hard Carry Association. Thank you for being here. I hope you'll attend our next meeting coming up, which is scheduled for the first Thursday in August, August 6th. Same time, same channel. Have a great day. Thank you everyone for attending.